I get a call from a record studio in Los Angeles. He said, "Kid, listen to this." He took the phone, he put it next to the speaker, and I'm in New York listening. And I heard My Way completed for the first time. And I started crying.
Frank Sinatra didn't just perform, he dominated. With a stare, a song, or a single word, he could freeze a room. But for all his fame and charm, there were always rumors, and only a few ever knew the truth. Now at 84, Paul Anka, the man behind Sinatra's most iconic song, is finally speaking out. What he reveals isn't just about My Way, it's about power, politics, and the private darkness Sinatra carried behind the glamour. Anka saw the legend when the lights were on, and the man when they weren't. For decades he kept quiet, but now the curtain lifts. And what Anka finally admits rewrites everything we thought we knew about Frank Sinatra. The song that changed everything. Paul Anka was already famous when the idea struck him, but fame wasn't enough. He wanted legacy, not teen idol fluff or screaming fans. He wanted to create something timeless, something that would live on long after the screaming stopped. And that something started with a French song most people had never heard of. Back in the late 1960s, while Sinatra was battling whispers of retirement, Anka stumbled upon a tune called Comme d'habitude. It was slow, haunting, dripping with sadness. But where others heard a fading melody, Anka saw fire. He immediately bought the rights, not to translate, but to transform it. At just 26, Anka sat down in a New York hotel room and rewrote the lyrics from scratch. Every word was designed not for just any singer, but for Frank Sinatra. This wasn't just songwriting, this was portraiture. Anka molded the lyrics around Sinatra's defiance, pride, ego, and emotional scars. And then came the line, "I did it my way." Not poetic, not sentimental, but perfect. 5 words that captured everything Sinatra had ever stood for, on stage, in tabloids, behind closed doors. Sinatra didn't need convincing. The first time he saw the lyrics, he knew. This wasn't just a song. It was a statement, a farewell, a warning, a final bow. He recorded My Way in December 1968, and though it never hit #1 in the US, it didn't need to. The world heard it, and never forgot it. It became his anthem, his armor, his legacy. It was the song he closed concerts with, the one fans wept to, the one that played at his funeral. And for Paul Anka, that song changed everything. It didn't just elevate his career, it bought him a seat at the table, a rare place beside the most powerful entertainer of the time. Because My Way wasn't just Sinatra's farewell. It was Anka's invitation. From teen idol to inner circle, My Way didn't just open doors for Paul Anka, it blew them off the hinges. Overnight, he was no longer just a successful young star. He was the man who had given Sinatra his soul in song, and that changed everything. Frank Sinatra wasn't the type to hand out loyalty. His inner circle was tight, protective, and mostly impenetrable. But Anka, he was different. Younger, ambitious, and smart enough to stay quiet and watch. That earned him something rare, trust. And with trust came access to everything. Sinatra invited him into the most exclusive circle in entertainment, the Rat Pack. A group that wasn't a band or a brand, it was a force. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford. On stage they were pure charm. Off stage, they were a storm. They dominated Las Vegas, drew crowds that included presidents and mobsters, and carried an aura that was untouchable. Suits sharp, drinks in hand, women by their side, the Rat Pack didn't perform cool. They defined it. Anka didn't have to pretend he belonged. Sinatra made sure he did. They called him the Kid. He was younger, sure, but not naive. He soaked in every joke, every deal, every late-night conversation that wasn't meant for outsiders. And behind all the laughter and glamour, he saw a different picture forming. The Rat Pack wasn't all smooth jazz and banter. There were rules unspoken, but ironclad. You didn't interrupt Sinatra. You didn't question a decision, and you definitely didn't make him look bad. Anka watched how even powerful men walked on eggshells around Frank. How Dean Martin, for all his wit, kept things light to avoid crossing lines. how Sammy Davis Jr., despite his charm, still navigated racial tension even among friends, how Lawford's political connections came with risks, and how Joey Bishop stayed in the background, always smiling, always careful. It was intoxicating, it was dangerous, and it was never just fun. The Rat Pack was an empire, and Sinatra, he was the emperor. From his new seat at the table, Anka saw that beneath the stage lights and laughter, there was something darker running beneath it all. And what he would soon learn was that this world wasn't just about show business. It was about power, protection, and the kind of secrets people didn't survive exposing. Behind the glamour Rat Pack reality, to outsiders, the Rat Pack was untouchable. They weren't just entertainers, they were the kings of cool, the original influencers, the living embodiment of American charisma. Crowds screamed, cameras flashed, politicians bent over backwards for an invitation to just one of their shows. But to Paul Anka, now sitting inside the empire, the view was different. The deeper he got, the more cracks he saw in the marble. The camaraderie was real, but so was the tension. The group lived in the spotlight, but operated like a secret society. Rules weren't written, but they were enforced. Violations didn't bring slaps on the wrist, they brought exile. Take Dean Martin. To the public, he was the happy-go-lucky drunk, the guy who'd slur a joke and still land the punchline. But that drunk was mostly an act. Dean was razor-sharp. He maintained his distance from chaos, always observing, rarely reacting. When things got too messy, he didn't yell, he disappeared. Sammy Davis Jr. was the Rat Pack's most versatile talent. Singer, dancer, impressionist, actor. He could do it all. But offstage, he carried the heaviest burden. He was black, Jewish, and in an interracial relationship during one of America's most racially volatile eras. While Sinatra defended him fiercely, others weren't as supportive. Venues often tried to block his bookings. Racist headlines haunted his name. Even among friends, he had to laugh off prejudice just to survive. Peter Lawford, meanwhile, was the bridge between showbiz and politics. Married into the Kennedy family, his value came from access, but power was fragile. When the Kennedys began distancing themselves from Sinatra, Lawford was caught in the crossfire, and Sinatra never forgave him. Joey Bishop was the glue, the straight man, the fixer of awkward silences. He never challenged Sinatra. He never tried to outshine the others. He simply stayed useful, and that's what kept him close. But none of them compared to Frank. Sinatra wasn't just the leader, he was the weather. If he was warm, the whole room was sunny. If he was cold, people froze. He could be charming one minute and volcanic the next. Anka saw how the group walked on emotional eggshells around him, how the jokes were often carefully timed, how silence fell when his mood shifted. And it shifted often. Anka remembered nights where laughter turned into sudden tension, where a playful jab turned into a full-blown feud, where even Dean Martin would retreat into himself, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. These weren't just performers. They were men juggling enormous egos, past traumas, and personal demons, all under the illusion of eternal brotherhood. The Vegas shows were dazzling. Yes, the tuxedos, the synchronized routines, the improvised banter. It was electric. But backstage, it was a powder keg. One wrong move, and years of friendship could go up in smoke. Anka, still young but increasingly aware, knew to keep his head down. He learned to read the room, especially Sinatra's eyes. One look could tell him everything. Stay, leave, speak, shut up. And what really unsettled him? The deeper he went into this world, the more he realized that the Rat Pack wasn't just a cultural phenomenon. It was a power structure, one that operated by its own rules, one where protection came at a price, and one where once you were in, walking away wasn't always an option. Whispers in the dark, Mafia and politic. As Paul Anka settled deeper into Sinatra's world, he realized that influence had layers. Fame got you through the door, but power, real power, came from the shadows. And in Sinatra's life, those shadows had names. Anka had heard the rumors like everyone else, stories of mob ties, shady favors, secret meetings, but inside the Rat Pack circle, those rumors had weight. They weren't just stories whispered in green rooms, they were truths hidden in plain sight. Names like Sam Giancana, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel weren't just distant figures from newspaper headlines, they were part of the backdrop in Sinatra's orbit. And Sinatra, he didn't deny knowing them. In fact, he rarely denied anything at all. He just didn't answer. Las Vegas was booming in the mid-20th century, and the mob had their fingerprints all over it. Casinos weren't just entertainment hubs. They were money laundering machines, union leverage tools, and strongholds of underground deals. And Sinatra wasn't just performing in those casinos, he was partnering in them. Anka remembered nights at the Calneva Lodge, the glamorous casino resort Sinatra partly owned. It sat on the border of California and Nevada, with secret tunnels and VIP rooms designed for privacy. It wasn't unusual to see celebrities, politicians, and known criminals rubbing shoulders there, everyone pretending the others weren't there. But one day, someone did notice: the Nevada Gaming Control Board. When mob boss Sam Giancana was spotted at the lodge, it triggered a full-scale investigation. Sinatra's gaming license was suspended. His ownership came under fire, and despite all his fame, he was forced to divest. The humiliation cut deep, not just because of the money, but because Sinatra had built much of his Vegas empire around that place. But it wasn't the first time the feds had eyes on him. The FBI had been watching Sinatra for decades. They compiled over 1,300 pages of surveillance records on him, documenting his movements, calls, associations. His connections to organized crime weren't just rumored, they were tracked. And though he was never formally charged with anything illegal, the cloud never left him. The biggest blow came during the 1960 Kennedy campaign. Sinatra campaigned hard for JFK. He rallied celebrities, organized fundraisers, brought out massive crowds. He believed he'd earned a permanent place at the president's side. He even went so far as to renovate his Palm Springs home, installing a helipad for JFK's planned visit. But that visit never happened. At the last minute, JFK changed plans and stayed with Bing Crosby instead, after his advisors warned him that Sinatra's ties to Giancana were too risky. Sinatra was livid, devastated, and he blamed one man, Peter Lawford, JFK's brother-in-law and Sinatra's own Rat Pack member. The fallout was immediate. Lawford was cut off, never forgiven. Just like that, years of friendship vanished with one presidential snub. Anka saw the raw emotion in Sinatra's face when the subject came up. The betrayal, the humiliation, the fury that simmered under his tuxedoed surface. And there were other unsettling stories. Like the time rumors surfaced that Sinatra helped secure mob-influenced union votes for Kennedy in Chicago. Nothing was proven, but the whispers lingered. Or the claim that Sinatra tried to act as a go-between for the mob and politicians, leveraging his fame to open doors others couldn't. One of the strangest revelations came years later. Sinatra allegedly offered to become an FBI informant. J. Edgar Hoover declined. Why? No one knows. Maybe they didn't trust him, or maybe they feared what he'd actually reveal. To Anka, it was like living inside a spy novel, except everything was real. He wasn't just watching history, he was walking through it, escorted by a man with one foot in the spotlight and the other deep in the underworld. In private, Anka never saw Sinatra act like a gangster, but he saw how people acted around him, the silence, the caution, the way even powerful men chose their words when Frank was near. Because they didn't know who was listening. And in a world built on loyalty, Sinatra's alliances were both his greatest weapon and his greatest curse. The private battles no one saw. On stage, Frank Sinatra was the embodiment of control. Every note was placed with surgical precision, every pause timed to perfection. But offstage, Paul Anka saw a man slowly unraveling piece by piece. Sinatra's greatest battles were never fought in front of an audience. They were fought in silence, alone, and often they left scars no camera could catch. Everyone knew he had a temper. The press called it feisty. His fans called it passion. But Anka knew better. That fire didn't come from ego. It came from pain. A lifetime of it. One of the deepest cracks ran through his love life. His marriage to Ava Gardner was beautiful and brutal. To the public, they were royalty. Sinatra, the ultimate crooner, and Ava the untouchable goddess. But behind the headlines, they fought like fire and gasoline. Their arguments were legendary, their reconciliations brief, and every time they fell apart, Sinatra sank lower. There were nights when Anka would see him stone silent, drink in hand, replaying conversations that had already ended. Nights when the laughter stopped, and Sinatra would retreat to the piano, not to perform but to grieve. He once told Anka, "She ruined me, kid, but I'd do it all again." It was Ava who nearly pushed him to the edge. After one of their most violent breakups, Sinatra was said to have attempted to end it all. The tabloids never printed the truth, but insiders whispered about the pills, the blackout, the tear-streaked phone calls in the middle of the night. That same ache bled into his music. Albums like In the Wee Small Hours weren't just songs, they were confessions. They didn't sell rebellion or romance, they sold regret. Real, raw regret. And fans loved him for it, never realizing they were buying pieces of a man quietly falling apart. But heartbreak wasn't all Sinatra endured. In 1963, his son Frank Jr. was kidnapped in Lake Tahoe. The world gasped, the headlines exploded, but Anka watched what no headline captured. The fear that clung to Sinatra like smoke, the phone calls, the pacing, the way his voice shook when he talked about the ransom. Sinatra paid $240,000 to bring his son back, and after that, he never looked at the world the same way again. He started carrying a roll of dimes in his pocket everywhere he went, a leftover from using payphones during the crisis. To him, it wasn't superstition, it was survival. Then, years later, came another devastating loss. In 1977, his mother Dolly Sinatra, his anchor, his shield, died in a plane crash while flying to see his show. Dolly was more than a mother. She was his protector, his political fixer, his fiercest defender. Her death crushed him. Friends said he didn't speak for days. When he did, it was only to curse the sky. The world saw him return to the stage. They saw the tuxedo, the swagger, but Paul Anka knew. Part of him never came back. Even his music career, though iconic, was filled with quiet heartbreak. Albums like Watertown projects he deeply believed in flopped. Critics called them brave. Audiences ignored them. For a man who could once command any crowd with a glance, the silence was unbearable. And then came the aging. By the late 80s, Sinatra's body began betraying him. In 1986, he collapsed mid-performance in Atlantic City. The cause? Diverticulitis, a painful condition he tried to hide. He recovered, but the invincible image had cracked. The next few years were filled with smaller signs, forgotten lyrics, missed cues, trembling hands. In 1994, during a show in Virginia, he fainted on stage. And this time, it wasn't something he could shake off. The press ran with it. Photos of him being helped off stage circulated everywhere. For fans, it was a shock. For Anka, it was confirmation of something he'd felt for years. Sinatra was fading. Behind closed doors, friends noticed the forgetfulness. He repeated stories, lost track of conversations. Sometimes he'd look at someone and blank for a second too long. The sharpest mind in showbiz was growing dull, and no one dared say it out loud. Anka stayed quiet. He offered support, but never pity. Because that's not what Sinatra wanted. He wanted loyalty, dignity, a place to sit in silence with someone who understood. And Anka did. He understood that behind every roar of applause was a man who never felt fully seen, that behind every encore was someone chasing something he could never quite catch. Fame had fed him, but it also starved him in other ways. And by the time the curtain truly began to fall, Sinatra wasn't chasing legacy. He was just trying to hold on to the last pieces of himself. The final curtain, Sinatra's last days. By the 1990s, Frank Sinatra's spotlight had begun to dim, not because the world stopped looking, but because he stopped stepping into it. His voice, once booming with bravado, had grown shaky. The swagger had softened, and the man who once ruled the stage like a king now struggled just to remember the lines that once flowed like second nature. Paul Anka saw it happening in real time, not all at once, but piece by piece. The physical signs came first. Sinatra's balance faltered. His timing slipped. The once effortless performances began requiring more effort than anyone was used to seeing from him. He started forgetting lyrics during live shows, glancing at cue cards, relying on the band to guide him back. But it wasn't just his voice. It was his memory, his energy, his light. He grew increasingly reclusive. Public appearances slowed to a crawl. He'd show up late or not at all. Sometimes he'd cancel at the last minute, no explanation. To the public, it looked like Sinatra was just aging. But to Anka and others close to him, it was clear he was slipping away. His wife, Barbara, began shielding him from the press, from visitors, from anything that might drain what little vitality he had left. Calls stopped being returned. Old friends were gently turned away. Sinatra, once the center of every room, now kept to the shadows of his own home. Anka never said much about those final visits, but you can hear it in his tone during interviews. There was a sadness he never fully put into words. Watching someone who once roared like a lion fade into silence is a kind of grief that doesn't need explanation. In 1994, during a performance in Richmond, Virginia, Sinatra fainted on stage. Cameras captured the moment. Fans were stunned. The media exploded. It was a public reminder of what Anka had already accepted in private. The final curtain was close. And then, on May 14, 1998, the news broke. Frank Sinatra had died of a heart attack in Los Angeles. He was 82, but for those who loved him, he'd been saying goodbye for years, slowly, quietly, bit by bit. The world went still. Radio stations paused their regular programming. News anchors stumbled through tributes, some choking back tears. Across continents, people played My Way on repeat. They cried not just for the man who had died, but for the era that died with him. His funeral at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills was a gathering of legends. Gregory Peck delivered a eulogy that left the room silent. Outside, thousands stood in the sun just for a glimpse of the hearse. Inside, floral arrangements spelled out, "the best." It wasn't just a lyric. It was the truth. Paul Anka didn't perform that day. He didn't make a speech. He didn't need to, because decades earlier, he'd already said everything in the only language Sinatra truly respected: music. My Way played as Sinatra's casket was lowered. The lyrics hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The same lyrics Anka had written in a single night, now marking the end of one of the most iconic lives in American history. I've loved, I've laughed and cried. I've had my fill. It wasn't just Sinatra's swan song. It was his confession, his autobiography, his last breath in melody. For Anka, it was surreal. He had watched Sinatra at his peak, written the song that redefined him, witnessed his rage, his joy, his decline. And now, he watched the world remember the man he had known so intimately, and yet still found impossible to fully understand. Because Frank Sinatra wasn't just a voice or a brand. He was the last of his kind. And now, he was gone. Paul Anka's truth. What he really saw in Sinatra. When Paul Anka looks back, he doesn't see just a friend or a collaborator. He sees a legend, and a man who never stopped being human underneath the legend's weight. For years, Anka remained respectful, careful not to paint Sinatra as a saint or a villain, but in interviews and memoirs, pieces of the truth began to surface, and those pieces were never simple. To Anka, Frank Sinatra was the greatest performer who ever lived. Not because of his voice, though it was flawless, not because of his timing, though it was unmatched, but because he meant every word he sang. He felt it, he bled through the lyrics. Even in a crowded arena, Sinatra made every person feel like he was singing just for them. But the gift came with fire. Sinatra could be demanding, controlling, even cruel. Anka once said, "When Frank says we're going to dinner, you go to dinner." That wasn't a suggestion. That was the law. Sinatra's orbit pulled everyone in, and if you stepped out of it, you'd feel the freeze. Most people either got crushed by that force or fled from it. But not Anka. He survived because he was different, calm where Sinatra was chaotic, diplomatic where Sinatra was explosive. He understood when to lean in and when to shut up. That emotional intelligence kept him close, not just to Sinatra's stage persona, but to the real man underneath it all. A man full of contradictions. Sinatra was fiercely loyal until he wasn't. He was generous until he felt used. He built people up, then tore them down in a single glare. And yet for those he trusted, he could be shockingly tender, protective, fatherly. Anka saw it all. The rage, the grief, the joy, the loneliness. He saw the legend crack under the weight of love lost, children endangered, public adoration twisted into paranoia. He saw the greatness and the price of maintaining it. And maybe that's why My Way still haunts him. Because Anka didn't just write a song for Sinatra, he wrote the truth. A truth most men can't admit, even on their deathbed. That yes, there were regrets. Yes, there were failures. But in the end, he chose his path, and never once apologized for it. For Anka, the final takeaway was clear. Sinatra wasn't perfect, but he was real. And in a world built on image and illusion, that made him more unforgettable than any polished myth ever could. So now we ask you, did Paul Anka ever get the credit he deserved for shaping Sinatra's legacy? Or has history buried the man behind My Way? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love old Hollywood stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and click the next video on your screen. Because there's always more behind the music.